I've been documenting cave accidents for 15 years now, and there's something that always strikes me about these stories. It's rarely the obvious mistakes that kill people underground. Most cavers who die aren't beginners making foolish choices. They're experienced, well-prepared people who encounter something they couldn't have anticipated. That's what makes these accidents so unsettling and so important to understand. 3 cases have stayed with me more than others. Not because they're the most dramatic, but because they show how quickly the underground world can turn against even the most careful explorers. Each one taught the caving community something different about the risks we face down there. The first happened in 1991 in Mexico's Chevé Cave system, deep beneath the mountains of Oaxaca. If you've never been to a place like Chevé, it's hard to understand what makes it so dangerous. From the surface, it looks like nothing, just a crack in the jungle floor, overgrown with vegetation. But that crack opens into one of the deepest cave systems ever explored, plunging more than 1,500 meters into the earth. That's nearly a mile of vertical descent through interconnected shafts, each one presenting its own technical challenges. Chevé isn't a cave you walk through. It's a vertical puzzle where every descent requires rope work, every anchor point becomes critical, and a single equipment failure can be fatal. The passages are wet from underground streams. The drops are measured in tens of meters, and once you're deep in the system, you're committed to hours of technical rope work just to reach the surface again. By 1991, several expeditions had pushed Chevé's depths, mapping what they could and establishing the rigging points needed for future exploration. The cave had already earned a reputation among serious cavers, not just for its depth, but for its unforgiving nature. Water constantly drips or flows through the system, making everything slippery. The limestone walls are often loose and fractured, and the sheer scale means that any rescue would be incredibly complex if possible at all. That year's American expedition was well-funded and experienced. They had the latest equipment, detailed surveys from previous teams, and a systematic approach to pushing deeper into unmapped territory. The team included cavers who'd worked big walls in Yosemite, explored caves across Mexico, and understood the technical demands of expedition caving. Chris Yerger was among them, a competent vertical caver with years of experience on rope. By the time the team reached the drop that would claim Yerger's life, they were already several hundred meters underground. They descended through a series of increasingly technical pitches, each one rigged carefully by the advanced team. The process is methodical in caves like Chevé. Locate solid rock for anchor points, drill holes for expansion bolts, test everything multiple times, then fix the rope for the rest of the team to follow. The fatal drop was about 23 meters, roughly 75 feet of free-hanging descent into a chamber below. It wasn't the deepest pitch they'd encountered that day, but it was technical. The chamber it led to was narrow and wet, with water from upper levels collecting in pools on the floor. The rock walls were typical Chevé limestone, solid in places, fractured in others. What made this drop particularly challenging was the rigging geometry. Chevé's passages rarely drop straight down. Instead, they angle and twist, requiring careful rope placement to avoid sharp edges that could cut through nylon under a caver's weight. The advanced team had spent considerable time positioning the rope to avoid such hazards, testing the setup with their own descents. When Yerger's turn came, everything appeared routine. He'd been using single rope technique for years, the standard method for cave exploration, where you rappel down using a mechanical descender called a rappel rack. The rack allows you to control your descent speed by adjusting how the rope threads through its metal bars. It's reliable technology that thousands of cavers use safely every day. Yerger clipped his rack to the rope, tested his connection, and leaned back to begin his descent. His teammates watched from above as he cleared the lip of the drop and began descending into the darkness below. For the first several meters, everything looked normal. Then something changed. Instead of the controlled, steady descent typical of good rope technique, Yerger began to spin. Rotation on rope isn't unusual. If a rope has twist in it, or if your weight isn't perfectly centered, you'll turn slowly as you descend. But this wasn't the gentle rotation cavers expect and compensate for. This was rapid and uncontrolled, his headlamp beam whipping around the chamber walls as he spun. Spinning creates additional forces on your equipment. It can cause carabiners to cross-load, put lateral stress on rappel devices, or even work connections loose if they're not properly tightened. An experienced caver like Yerger would have recognized the problem immediately and taken steps to control it, grabbing the rope above his device, using his feet to stop the rotation against the wall, or adjusting his descender. But before he could react, his teammates heard the sound that would haunt them forever, the sharp clatter of metal against rock, followed immediately by the unmistakable thud of a human body hitting stone. Yerger's rappel rack had failed. Whether the spinning had worked it loose, whether it was improperly threaded, or whether something else had gone wrong, they couldn't tell from above. What mattered was the result. The silence that followed was deafening. No calls for help, no movement visible in their headlamp beams, just the constant drip of water echoing through the chamber. Cave accidents often announce themselves with terrible clarity. You know immediately when something catastrophic has happened. Yerger's teammates moved as quickly as safety allowed, but quickly, in a place like Chevé, is relative. Each caver had to descend the same rope system, and now every connection, every piece of gear, every movement was checked and double-checked. The rope that had just failed one of their team was their only way down to help him, and their only way back to the surface. When the first rescuer reached the chamber floor, he found Yerger lying in a shallow pool of water, face up and motionless. His left leg was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. He wasn't breathing. There was no pulse. The fall had been perhaps 15 meters, survivable in many circumstances, but not when you land on limestone surrounded by shallow water. This is where cave rescue becomes both deeply human and clinically methodical. These weren't strangers responding to an emergency call. This was a close-knit expedition team trying to save someone they'd been living and working with for weeks. Someone who'd shared their meals, their jokes, their excitement about pushing into Virgin Cave. But they were also hundreds of meters underground with limited equipment and no way to call for outside help. They began CPR immediately. The chamber was cramped, barely large enough for 3 people to work around a prone body, and everything was wet. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling, and their movements echoed off the limestone walls. They worked by headlamp, taking turns with chest compressions and rescue breathing, switching off every few minutes to avoid exhaustion. For 30 minutes, they fought to bring Chris back. They checked for pulse, adjusted his position, cleared his airway, and continued compressions. In a hospital, this would be a full code blue with teams of specialists, cardiac monitors, and advanced life support equipment. In Chevé Cave, it was 3 cavers with basic first aid training, working by lamplight in a space the size of a small bedroom. After half an hour with no response, no pulse, no breathing, no sign of consciousness, they had to face reality. Chris was gone. The fall had likely killed him immediately, and all their efforts couldn't change that. It's a decision no one wants to make, but experienced cavers understand the mathematics of underground rescue. You can't save someone who's already dead, and you can't risk additional lives in the attempt. What happened next illustrates the brutal logistics of deep cave rescue. In a normal outdoor emergency, you'd call for helicopter evacuation or at least ground transport to a hospital. In Chevé, they were hundreds of vertical meters from the surface, accessible only through a series of technical rope climbs that would challenge even uninjured cavers. Extracting a body from Chevé would require specialized hauling equipment they didn't have, additional manpower they couldn't summon, and would put the entire team at risk. A limp, dead weight being hauled up multiple pitches could dislodge rocks, tangle on obstacles, or cause equipment failures that would trap or kill the rescuers. They made the decision that cave rescue teams make more often than the public realizes: leave the body in place. This wasn't callousness or abandonment. They moved Yerger carefully away from the main water flow to a more protected alcove in the same chamber. They positioned him respectfully, secured loose gear, and marked the location for future recovery attempts. Then they began the long, somber process of climbing back to the surface. The same technical rope work they'd been doing all day now weighted with grief and the knowledge that they were leaving a teammate behind. The expedition ended that day. Word spread quickly through the international caving community, not just about the accident, but about the circumstances. An experienced caver using standard technique on properly rigged rope had died, and no one could say exactly why. It forced a re-examination of rappel rack usage, rope rigging techniques, and the inherent risks of deep cave exploration. Chevé would eventually be explored to even greater depths, but always with Chris Yerger's accident in mind. New safety protocols were developed, equipment standards were reviewed, and the cave rescue community studied the incident for lessons that might prevent similar tragedies. But the fundamental lesson remained unchanged. In places like Chevé, your life depends entirely on your equipment performing perfectly every single time, and sometimes even perfect preparation isn't enough. The second case takes us to an entirely different environment. England's Derbyshire region, where limestone caves have been carved by centuries of water flow into tight, technical passages that flood easily and offer little margin for error. The caves here aren't the grand vertical systems of Mexico. They're intimate, demanding places where you crawl on your belly through flooded passages, navigate complex three-dimensional mazes, and encounter some of the most challenging underwater sections in British caving. Merlin's mine is typical of the region, a wet, unforgiving system that looks unimpressive from the surface, but becomes increasingly technical as you penetrate deeper. The entrance is just a muddy hole in limestone, easily missed if you don't know what you're looking for. But beyond that entrance lies a network of passages that have challenged some of Britain's best cavers. In the summer of 1974, this unremarkable cave claimed the life of John Smith, known throughout the caving community as Shag, a nickname that spoke to both his personality and his standing among his peers. Smith was a member of the Pegasus Caving Club, one of the most active and safety-conscious organizations in the Peak District. These weren't weekend hobbyists, but serious cavers who approached exploration with military precision. The Pegasus team had been working Merlin's mine for months, systematically pushing past obstacles that had stopped previous expeditions. Their current target was a sump, a section of passage completely filled with water, no airspace above, that blocked further exploration. For non-cavers, it's hard to appreciate what a sump represents. It's not just a swimming challenge or an underwater crawl. It's a section where you must submerge completely, navigate by touch through tight passages you've never seen, and trust that there's breathable air on the other side. The team's approach was methodical. Rather than attempt the sump immediately, they planned to build a temporary dam upstream, diverting enough water to lower the sump level and allow dry passage. It was engineering rather than heroics, the kind of problem-solving approach that characterized serious British caving in the 1970s. But before committing to the considerable work of dam construction, someone needed to assess what lay beyond the sump. Smith volunteered to take a look. The sump was relatively short, maybe 12 to 15 feet of completely submerged passage, and if there was even a small airspace on the other side, it would change their entire approach to the system. This kind of reconnaissance dive was routine for cavers of Smith's experience. The technique was straightforward. Gear up with basic diving equipment, attach a safety line to your harness, establish clear signals with your surface team, and make a quick penetration to assess conditions beyond the sump. Smith had done similar dives dozens of times. The safety protocols were standard for the era. Smith would be connected to his team by a rope line, his lifeline to the surface, and his primary means of communication. The signal system was simple but effective. One tug meant he was okay and continuing. 2 tugs meant he was returning. 3 tugs meant he'd found airspace beyond the sump. If anything went wrong, he could follow the line back to his team. Smith geared up with the diving equipment available in 1974, basic but functional. This was before the specialized cave diving gear that's standard today, but the principles were the same. Maintain buoyancy control, navigate by touch, conserve air, and always maintain contact with your safety line. The sump entrance was typical of Derbyshire caves, barely wide enough to accommodate a caver in full gear, with sharp limestone edges that could catch equipment or cut exposed skin. The water inside was cold and still, but Smith knew that any movement would stir up silt from the bottom, reducing visibility to zero almost immediately. Smith slipped into the water and disappeared from his teammates' view. They watched his safety line play out as he navigated the submerged passage. The rope moved steadily at first, then paused as Smith presumably assessed the passage ahead. Cave diving, even in short sections like this, requires careful navigation. You can't see where you're going, you navigate primarily by feel, and turning around in a confined space can be disorienting. Within a minute, the rope jerked 3 times in quick succession. The agreed signal. Smith had found airspace beyond the sump. Good news. The team expected him to spend a few minutes assessing the chamber he'd found, then return through the sump to report his findings. This was exactly how these reconnaissance dives were supposed to work. Then the rope went slack and stayed that way. Minutes passed. Smith should have been returning by now, or at least maintaining some tension on the line as he moved around in the airspace. But the line lay lifeless on the water surface, no movement, no signals, no indication of what was happening beyond the sump. After waiting longer than anyone was comfortable with, one of Smith's teammates geared up for a rescue dive. This wasn't panic. Cave rescue protocols require patience and systematic response, but something was clearly wrong. The teammate followed Smith's line through the sump, navigating the same tight, zero-visibility passage Smith had traversed minutes earlier. When the rescuer emerged into the airspace Smith had discovered, he found a scene that still puzzles cave accident investigators today. Smith was there, upright in about 3 feet of water, his arms extended forward as if he'd been swimming or walking when he simply stopped. His diving mask was still properly positioned, his regulator was still in his mouth, and there were no signs of panic or struggle. He looked, according to the rescuer's later account, like he had simply stopped being alive. No torn equipment, no evidence of entanglement, no injuries visible on his body. His positioning suggested he'd been conscious and mobile when whatever happened to him occurred. The entire sequence, from entering the sump to being found motionless, had taken less than 3 minutes. The rescuer checked for vital signs and found none. Smith was dead, though the cause wasn't immediately apparent. The airspace he discovered was small but adequate, with no obvious hazards. The water was shallow enough to stand in. Nothing about the environment explained why an experienced caver would die so suddenly and apparently peacefully. This is where cave rescue becomes both a technical challenge and a deeply emotional ordeal. The rescuer was now alone in an air-filled chamber beyond a sump, with a dead teammate and no way to communicate with the surface team. Standard protocol required him to return through the sump immediately to report the situation, but leaving Smith's body felt wrong on every human level. Professional judgment won out. The rescuer checked Smith's equipment one more time, then made his way back through the sump to report what he'd found. The news devastated the surface team. They'd been monitoring a routine reconnaissance dive, expecting Smith to emerge with information about the passage ahead. Instead, they were facing a body recovery in one of the most challenging environments possible. The recovery itself required careful coordination. Someone had to dive back through the sump with additional equipment to prepare Smith's body for transport. Then they had to maneuver him through the tight, underwater passage without disturbing the silt that would make navigation impossible. All of this had to be done in zero visibility, working entirely by touch, with the emotional weight of handling a deceased friend and teammate. It took several hours to extract Smith's body from the chamber and bring it back to the main cave. The team worked methodically, taking no chances that would create additional casualties. When they finally emerged from Merlin's mine, they carried not just Smith's body, but questions that would never be fully answered. The subsequent investigation found no clear cause of death. Smith hadn't drowned. His lungs contained no water. He showed no signs of trauma or equipment failure. Some speculated about sudden medical episodes, others about possible carbon dioxide poisoning in the confined airspace, but nothing was conclusive. The coroner eventually ruled it an accidental death associated with cave diving, but the specific cause remained unknown. Smith's death sent shockwaves through the British caving community, not just because of the loss of an experienced caver, but because of how inexplicable it was. Here was someone using proper technique, following established safety protocols, with competent backup in a well-understood situation. Yet somehow, in the space of minutes, everything went fatally wrong. The accident led to significant changes in cave diving practices. Safety protocols were revised, equipment standards were upgraded, and training programs were expanded. But the fundamental lesson of Smith's death remained troubling. Sometimes experienced cavers die for reasons that are never fully understood in situations that should have been completely manageable. My third story happened more recently, in Yorkshire's long Churn Cave system, and it illustrates a different kind of underground hazard, one that many cavers underestimate until they experience it firsthand. Stuart Goodwill and Caroline Fletcher were both professional engineers, trained problem solvers who understood risk assessment, safety margins, and the importance of contingency planning. They approached caving with the same methodical mindset they brought to their professional work. On the day they died, they made what appeared to be all the right decisions. The cave killed them anyway. Long churn is what Yorkshire cavers call a sporting system, challenging enough to be interesting, but not so extreme as to be unreasonably dangerous. It's the kind of cave that attracts experienced cavers looking for a good day out underground without the logistical complexity of expedition caving. The passages include everything from comfortable walking sections to tight crawls, short climbs, and the kind of varied terrain that keeps caving interesting. But long churn has a characteristic that makes it potentially lethal. It's extremely responsive to surface rainfall. The cave system acts as a drainage network for a significant area of Yorkshire moorland. When it rains hard in the catchment area, water funnels in a long churn faster than most people would believe possible. What starts as a pleasant underground stream can become a torrential river in a matter of minutes. This isn't unusual in Yorkshire caving. Many of the region's caves are weather-dependent, and experienced local cavers develop an instinct for reading conditions. They check rainfall forecasts obsessively, monitor water levels at cave entrances, and maintain strict turnaround times that get them out before conditions deteriorate. Stuart and Caroline knew this. They'd been caving in Yorkshire long enough to understand the risks. On the morning of their final trip, they checked the weather forecast like responsible cavers do. Rain was predicted, but nothing that suggested immediate danger. The amounts forecasted were significant, but not extreme, and the timing suggested they'd have several hours underground before conditions became problematic. They planned accordingly, a relatively short trip to complete some survey work in passages they'd been mapping over previous visits. This is important to understand. Stuart and Caroline weren't pushing into unknown territory or attempting something at the edge of their capabilities. They were doing routine survey work in familiar passages, the kind of systematic exploration that builds detailed maps of cave systems. It's methodical, careful work that most cavers consider relatively low risk. Their planned route would take them through Long Churn's entrance series, past several well-known landmarks, and into the passage sections they'd been surveying. The trip was designed to be completed in 3 to 4 hours, well within safety margins for the weather conditions they expected. But weather forecasting, especially in Yorkshire, isn't an exact science. The atmospheric systems that bring rain to the Pennines can intensify rapidly, and local topography can create microclimates that aren't captured in regional forecasts. While Stuart and Caroline were underground conducting their survey work, the rainfall above them intensified well beyond predictions. Long Churn Cave began doing what it does when hit with significant rainfall, transforming from a pleasant stream cave into something much more dangerous. The change doesn't happen gradually. Yorkshire cavers describe it as a switch being flipped. One minute you're walking along an ankle-deep stream. The next you're fighting waist-deep current that threatens to sweep you off your feet. When Stuart and Caroline realized what was happening, they abandoned their survey work and began heading toward the entrance immediately. This was exactly the right decision, the textbook response to rising water in a Yorkshire cave. Their engineering backgrounds probably helped them assess the situation quickly and make the correct choice without wasting time debating options. But recognizing the danger and escaping it are different things. The passages they needed to traverse were now carrying significantly more water, and the character of that water was changing rapidly. What had been a pleasant stream when they entered was becoming a powerful flow capable of knocking cavers off their feet and dragging them into hazardous areas. The physics of moving water underground is unforgiving. Unlike surface streams where you might be able to grab vegetation or crawl out on a bank, cave streams are constrained by rock walls that offer few handholds. The water doesn't just push you downstream. It can pin you against obstacles, trap your legs in rock formations, or drag you into sections where the ceiling drops low enough to prevent your head from staying above water. As Stuart and Caroline retreated through passages that were now running with increasingly dangerous water levels, they encountered the problem that would ultimately kill them: rope entanglement. Somewhere in the tighter sections of the cave, likely where the passage narrows significantly and creates increased water velocity, they became tangled in rope. Whether this was their own gear, rigging left by previous cavers, or rope they were carrying for survey work, the flowing water wrapped it around them like a snare. Once rope becomes entangled around your body in moving water, you're in immediate mortal danger. The water tension turns rope into something that can't be loosened by hand strength, and the more you struggle, the tighter it becomes. I've talked to cave rescue specialists about rope entanglements in flowing water, and they all describe the same scenario: rapid, progressive tightening that quickly restricts movement and breathing. Even if you have a knife to cut the rope, deploying it while fighting turbulent water and rope tension around your chest is nearly impossible. Stuart and Caroline were swept into a section where the cave floor drops suddenly, the kind of feature that creates hydraulic turbulence even in normal conditions. With flood levels, these drops become death traps. The water doesn't flow smoothly over them, but creates the kind of circulating currents that can hold swimmers underwater indefinitely. The search and rescue operation that followed shows both the capability and the limitations of Yorkshire's cave rescue community. The cave rescue organization mobilized within hours of Stuart and Caroline being reported overdue. These are experienced local cavers who know the cave systems intimately and train regularly for exactly these scenarios. But the rescue team faced the same conditions that had trapped Stuart and Caroline: a cave system running at dangerous flood levels with powerful currents, reduced visibility, and unstable conditions. They couldn't safely enter the cave until water levels began to recede, which meant precious hours passed before rescue operations could begin. When the team finally reached the section where Stuart and Caroline had been trapped, they found both cavers entangled in rope and drowned in approximately 3 feet of fast-moving water. The scene told the story clearly. Two experienced cavers who had made appropriate decisions but been overcome by conditions that developed faster than they could escape. The subsequent coroner's investigation was thorough and found no evidence of poor judgment or inadequate preparation. Stuart and Caroline had checked weather forecasts, planned an appropriate trip, and responded correctly when conditions changed. But Yorkshire caves in flood conditions don't forgive timing errors, and they were simply too deep in the system when the water rose. The case became a watershed moment for weather-dependent caving in Britain. New protocols were developed for monitoring rainfall intensity, not just amounts. Weather monitoring became more sophisticated, and turnaround times became more conservative. But the fundamental lesson remained sobering. Even when you do everything right, sometimes the underground environment changes faster than you can adapt. I've covered enough cave accidents to recognize patterns in how people die underground. Equipment failures like Chris Yerger's rappel rack malfunction. Inexplicable medical episodes like John Smith's sudden death in Merlin's mine. Environmental hazards like the flood that claimed Stuart Goodwill and Caroline Fletcher. Each type of accident teaches the caving community something different about managing risk in an inherently dangerous environment. What strikes me most about these 3 cases is that none of the victims made obvious mistakes. Yerger was using standard technique on properly rigged rope. Smith was following established safety protocols with competent backup. Stuart and Caroline were responding appropriately to changing conditions underground. These weren't stories of inexperience, poor judgment, or reckless behavior. They were reminders that caving, even when done correctly, operates on narrow margins where small problems can cascade into fatal consequences. The caving community learns from these deaths in ways that might surprise outsiders. Rather than being discouraged from underground exploration, cavers study these accidents obsessively, looking for lessons that might prevent similar tragedies. Equipment standards are revised, training programs are updated, safety protocols are refined. Each death contributes to a body of knowledge that makes caving incrementally safer for everyone. But we also accept that some risks can't be completely eliminated. Caves are inherently dangerous places where human life depends on equipment working perfectly, conditions remaining within acceptable parameters, and a dozen small things going right simultaneously. When any of those factors fail, experienced cavers can die as easily as beginners. That's not meant to discourage people from exploring caves. It's meant to encourage appropriate humility. The moment you think you've mastered the underground environment is probably the moment it will surprise you. These 3 cases taught me that surviving underground isn't just about skill and preparation, though both are essential. It's also about accepting that some risks can't be completely controlled, only carefully managed. Every serious caver carries these stories with them, not as warnings to stay out of caves, but as reminders never to take the underground world for granted. We remember Chris Yerger when we check our rappel racks one more time. We think of John Smith when we brief dive safety protocols. We honor Stuart and Caroline by watching weather forecasts obsessively and maintaining conservative turnaround times. That's probably the most important lesson any of us can learn, whether we're cavers or simply people who venture into wild places. Respect the environment you're entering, prepare as thoroughly as possible, but never forget that nature doesn't care about your experience level or good intentions. Sometimes doing everything right still isn't enough, and that humbling reality is what keeps the rest of us alive.